This video concerns the AQA English Language Paper 2 exam with a focus on question 3. So as with the other videos, you're going to need to download the source material that goes with this question, and you can access that via the AQA website or by typing in this link into your search browser. Whichever way you do it, it should take you to the assessment resources page where you can click on the Paper 2 specimen insert link, and that material should just automatically download for you to begin to read. So question 3 carries 12 marks, and therefore we would recommend you to spend about 15 minutes on this question. It's important to remember then that question 3 is language analysis again, and this is something that you've already practiced on paper 1 with question 2, so you're probably going to see a lot of parallels here between this video and the one for paper 1 question 2, and it's also the same skill that you've practiced for your literature exam whenever you have been hitting the AO2 criteria. So question 3 is going to ask you to comment on the effect and the impact of language, and hopefully you will remember from paper 1 question 2 that language can be broken down into three separate sections, and that is words and phrases, sentence forms, and also language techniques. So let's have a reminder then of what those three things can entail. So when it comes to words and phrases, you're looking for things like verbs, any powerful, interesting verbs. Same with any adjectives, powerful or particularly provocative. Any particular nouns, the use of monosyllabic language, maybe the use of adverbs, pronouns, prepositions perhaps, semantic fields. This isn't an exhaustive list. There are multiple different words and phrases that you could use, but these are just some of the more prominent ones to be on the lookout for. In terms of sentence forms, again not an exhaustive list, but you've got things like your simple, your compound and complex. We've also got certain types of complex sentence such as the embedded clause and the multi-clause sentence, and then we've got those 4 types of sentence that we came across in the paper 1 question 2 video: interrogatives, imperatives, exclamatory and declarative sentences. If those aren't fresh in your mind, you don't know what they are, do just pause the video now and have a little look at this diagram to try and explain that further. Now when it comes to language techniques for this question, for paper 2, it can be helpful to look at it depending on the TAP. So just a reminder of the TAP process. It's something that hopefully you will have already applied during your 15 minutes reading time. And all TAP means is to look at an individual source and ask yourself, what is the text? So what is the style of the writing? What's the form? What form is it written in? The A relates to audience, so you ask yourself, okay, who is this written for? And then P is all about purpose, so you ask yourself, why has this been written? What was the intention? So we can divide up, in this case, the language techniques by the purpose, and there are different language techniques for a couple of different purposes. I've broken it down into entertainment as a purpose, and then also persuasion as another purpose. So let's firstly have a look at these entertainment language techniques, which generally you'll come across in paper 1 because they're more creative, but that doesn't mean that they can't appear on paper 2 as well. So we've got things like similes and metaphors, repetition, maybe the use of motif, personification, alliteration, maybe the use of sensory language, symbolism and general imagery. So if we just pan over now to the more persuasive techniques, and these are the sorts of things that you might be thinking about using in your writing side of paper 2, because these are more the techniques that are used to persuade your reader. So things such as emotive language, the use of exclamatories, which if you're not aware are kind of outbursts of emotion such as O or R. We've got rhetorical questions, statistics perhaps, hyperbole, tricolon, which is basically a fancy way of saying a list of 3, and then direct address. So if you weren't familiar with any of those, or you wanted to write any down or make notes on them, then you can always rewind the video and pause and do what you want with that material. Okay, so as always, before you answer the question, you need to focus on exactly what it's asking you. So in this case, the question is, you need to refer only to source B, the letter by Henry to his father. How does Henry use language to try to influence his father? So you're probably familiar with this process by now, but do pause the video and consider which bits of this question are actually key. What are the bits that you need to really focus on? So hopefully you did pause that, and I have identified similar areas. So firstly, it's important to note that you need to refer only to source B, so you can completely discount source A for this part. I suppose I should have underlined the letter by Henry to his father in this case, because if you, and hopefully you will have, read the sources, then you'll notice that source B is actually split up into two sections. One letter is by Henry, the other letter is by his father, and so you just need to go careful that you isolated all of your points to the letter by Henry and not part B of that source. Then it's important to note this idea of language, and hopefully it should be ingrained in your head by the time we get to the exam that can mean words and phrases, language techniques, and also sentence forms. And then we've got arguably the most important bit of the question, which is to influence his father, because this is the question topic, and therefore every single point that you make, every single word you analyse, every single language technique you pick out, it has to all lead back to how it shows Henry trying to influence his father. So everything needs to link back to that question topic. So, seeing as we're talking about the tap and how that's such a useful tool, let's apply it, if you haven't done so already, to the letter that you've got in front of you. So the text, well, it's quite clearly a letter. The audience is to a family member, in fact to a father. So naturally that might already tell you that it's going to be quite personal and quite an intimate letter. And then the purpose itself is to persuade the father to bring him home, which of course links with our question topic. So what I would recommend that you do now is to pause the video and analyse that source for specific words and phrases, sentence forms, and language techniques that all show how Henry is trying to use his language, to use these three areas to influence and to persuade his father. So do pause the video now, try it for yourself, and then we'll check back in a second to see what results we have found. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video and had some success in finding different examples of the three areas that you could put forward in an answer. So let's firstly focus on words and phrases. Now, whenever I'm giving examples of things that you might have picked out from the source, do bear in mind that it's not an exhaustive list. If you find something different, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong or I'm right. It's just that there's only a limited number of examples here. So firstly, I've picked out the quote which made me very unhappy. You could say that the adjective unhappy appears quite childlike. If it was an adult writer, and they were really trying to persuade someone, they might have gone for a more kind of powerful, maybe more sophisticated adjective, but unhappy is quite basic and childlike. So I've said that perhaps it creates a sense of innocence to persuade the father that the child is actually vulnerable and in need of protection. I also picked out he would flog me if he knew it. So the verb flog creates quite a violent image because it means to be beaten with a stick. So that insinuates that Henry is actually in danger. Now for a father reading that, because we obviously know who the audience is, that would definitely have emotive connotations and would hopefully influence the father to protect his son. And then we've also got the phrase, your respectful son, which is very, very formal. It's the way that Henry signs off the letter. And that creates a real sense of politeness, as if Henry's trying to use this to flatter and please his father. So let's move on to sentences then. You may have noticed the use of my dear father, which is repeated throughout, but it's also included as an embedded clause, and it acts as a regular reminder that Henry is appealing emotively to his father. The phrase is a term of endearment, but it's also a way of flattering his father to achieve his purpose, perhaps. We then get the sentence, the closing statement to the letter. George is quite well but very unhappy. This is a simple sentence, and it contrasts to some of Henry's longer and more emotive phrases that we've seen throughout the letter. I know we're only focusing on Henry's letter to his father, but it's worth noting that in part B, where Henry's father writes to somebody else about this issue, we can infer from that the father does have a bit of a soft spot for the son George, and therefore for Henry to use George in that kind of blunt, short sentence right at the end of the letter may actually be a bit of a persuasive tool, as if he's trying to shock his father by sort of playing on his emotions and therefore encouraging him to bring both of the boys home. So in terms of language features, we've already picked up on the use of my dear father with the embedded clause, but if you wanted to, you could always refer to a language technique with that quote, because you could talk about the use of repetition, and how he's sort of using it to emphasise, how much he loves his father, perhaps, or again as a term of flattery. Then I picked out the quote, which makes me very unhappy. Again, we've seen that quote before, but in terms of language techniques, you could talk about the emotive language and the way that would really pull on the father's heartstrings and hopefully stir him to take some action and bring the boys home, which is exactly what Henry wants. Then you might have identified the simile, treated more like bears than Christians. Again, that creates quite a childish image, and for me, when I read this, I get that idea of childish images popping up quite a lot, particularly here again, just to emotively stir the father into taking action again. And then finally I picked out, if God permit me to live as long. Now there were multiple examples of hyperbole in this extract, but I thought this was perhaps the most prominent. So the hyperbole, which basically means over-exaggeration, creates the sense of desperation, as if Henry is being so mistreated that his life is in danger. This again emphasises his childishness, because it just seems a bit of an over-the-top kind of childish, desperate kind of last attempt to get his dad to take action. But in turn, it does actually remind us how vulnerable Henry is, and how much he is in need of his father's guidance, really. So hopefully you found some similar points, but let's see how we might put that together into a coherent paragraph. So, same process, you're going to need to follow the P.E.A. paragraph, point, evidence, analyse. But before you do that, you would need to introduce with a topic sentence. So this is where you would discuss which of the three features you're going to be talking about in the upcoming paragraph. And by three features, I mean language techniques, words and phrases, or sentence forms. You're then going to need to put forward your point, which is where you offer a comment about how Henry tries to influence his father. Then some evidence to back that up. Try to be concise with the quote. You don't need to put anything extra in there that you don't need. And then we're into the main chunk here, and the most important bit, where you actually analyse. So you're drawing on subject terminology to analyse the effect of the word. And remember what we said at the start of this video is all about considering the impact of a technique or a sentence. So how is the language influential? How is it persuasive? And how is it achieving the intended purpose? So really kind of unpacking the quote. If you want to, you can pause the video now and attempt to write up one of the points that you found before, or one of the points that we discussed, into a point, evidence, analyse paragraph, and then you can compare it with the next slide. So do pause the video now if you would like to do that. So here on the screen you can see an example of a point, evidence, analyse paragraph. I chose to develop the point on a language technique, which was and I developed the hyperbole point. So do just read that and take note of all the different, what all of these different stages of the paragraph actually look like in the flesh. So do pause the video now and have a read of that example. So when you're unpacking the quote, in order to achieve a really in-depth analysis and a kind of a meaty P.E.A. paragraph, if you like, there are some things just on the screen at the moment to help you to unpack that and things to consider. So you might consider what images are being created by certain words. Are they positive images? Are they negative images? If so, you can question, okay, why would the writer have wanted me to imagine that at this point? You can listen out for any sounds that are being created, so that would be created by alliteration or perhaps onomatopoeia, for instance. Are they harsh sounds? Are they soft sounds, long or short? And again, explore the impact of those sounds. So when you say them out loud, what kind of emotions are attached to those sounds. You need to be asking yourself this at all times, really. What are the connotations of the word or the technique? So basically, what do we associate with it? What can we kind of infer from it? Again, question why would the writer want you to make those associations? And then finally, you can also consider the tone. So what kind of mood and atmosphere is being created by the writing, and how does it make the reader feel is always a really good thing to include in your answer. So if you don't already have a note of these, I would definitely recommend pausing the video to jot these down. These are just some different phrases to help you analyse. So for instance, this suggests, this invites the reader to think or feel, this implies, this evokes, this creates the impression, this creates the image of, this contributes to, this gives the sense that, and this connotes. So these are some good phrases to have up your sleeve. Okay, let's have a recap of this process then for Paper 2, Question 3. Firstly, you're going to need to underline the key parts of the question. If, and it didn't for this particular example, but if the question does dictate only a couple of lines for you to look at or a section of the text for you to look at, do remember to draw a box around it so you don't get tempted to look outside of that area. Then you need to decide the tap, and that actually might be something that you've already done in the reading process, but if you haven't, definitely do it by the time you get to this stage. Then you need to identify words and phrases within the section of text that you're allowed, words and phrases, language techniques and sentence forms that are going to help you answer the question. So really do keep that question focus in mind. And then you need to aim for about 3 to 4 P.E.A. paragraphs where you develop your ideas in depth and detail, always linking to the question topic. That's absolutely crucial. We need to feel like every single point that you've raised is helping you to answer the question that you've been given. So finally, some things to watch out for. Only base your answer on information from inside the designated lines if the question dictates that. Use subject terminology, so all of those different examples of words and phrases, language techniques and sentence forms, do build that into your revision because you're definitely going to need to use subject terminology if you want to score well in this question. Don't be tempted to just feature spot, and by that I don't just mean saying, oh, there was the use of a simile on line whatever. It's not going to get you any marks. You have to actually explore the impact if you're actually going to get anywhere in this question. So don't feature spot, use the technique or the word that you've found in order to kind of unpack what's really going on and the feelings behind the writing. Make sure you link all of your points to the topic that you've been asked about. So again, that all comes down to that question focus. So do make sure that you analyse the question before you even begin to answer it and highlight all of those key bits. So that is everything for question 3.